This begins part 2 of 3 for Chapter 3, Introduction to Culture. The existence of diffusion becomes apparent only when we recognize it is a reaction toward cultural variation. Because each culture possesses its own unique character due to circumstantial adaptations such as climate, technology, population, and geography, we can then begin to understand how cultural variation develops. Despite the presence of cultural universals, variations can lead to the displaying of these universals in different manners, sometimes even within different sectors of a culture's population. A subculture is a segment of society that shares a distinctive pattern of customs, rules, and traditions that differs from the pattern of the larger society. Examples of a subculture could be college students, storm trackers, computer geeks. As we think about each group, common characteristics will come to mind that allow us to identify the groups accordingly. A typical characteristic is the use of argot, which is a specialized language that is distinctive to a particular subculture. Argot is a form of terminology that most of us would not be familiar with unless we belonged to that specific subculture. Countercultures differ from subcultures in the sense that they deliberately oppose certain aspects rather than acclimating to the dominant society expectations, as subcultures typically do. Countercultures generally thrive among the young who have the least investment in the existing culture. Examples of countercultures include the KKK, Hells Angels, or militia groups. One last feature of exposure to other cultures is demonstrated through culture shock, which is a feeling of disorientation, uncertainty, being out of place, or even fearful when immersed in an unfamiliar culture. All of us, to some extent, take for granted the cultural practices of our society. As a result, it can be surprising and even disturbing to realize that other cultures do not follow our way of life. Language is one of the major elements underlying culture variations and can be distinguished through speech, written characters, numerals, and symbols, as well as gestures and other forms of nonverbal communication. Language is a social phenomenon because it arises naturally and inevitably in all human groups. Sociologists typically will look at the sounds, grammars, and meanings of the world's languages in search of how languages function in their social setting. Many believe that humans are genetically programmed to learn language, but it still takes social contact to turn on the switch that makes us talk. Because our social networks tend to be complex, we all use multiple versions of our native language. We may speak differently when we're with friends, relatives, or strangers, when we're at home, when we're in school, or when we're on the job. The context of communication determines whether our words are spoken or written, formal or informal, full of slang or technical jargon, off-color, colorful, or even colorless. The social context of communication also affects to the degree to which our language approaches or avoids the norms of correctness that our speech community deems appropriate to the occasion. Social contact and social conflict both shape language. When World War I produced strong anti-German feeling in the United States, some Americans abandoned words of obvious German origin, such as Frankfurter and sauerkraut, in favor of hot dog and Liberty cabbage. Such gestures are purely superficial, symbolic, and in the case of Liberty cabbage, temporary. On the international scene, sociologists are looking at how American English influences other languages through popular music, film, television, and the internet. Speaking American can be a status symbol, yet it can also conjure the unwelcome image of an arrogant superpower. The social aspects of language often reflect a wide range of non-language issues. Language is social and can shape how we see, taste, smell, and hear. Language influences us on the way we feel about other people's ideas and objects around us. Language is the means by which a culture communicates its most important norms, values, and sanctions. Just as language, nonverbal communication also provides a means of teaching and expressing social expectations. We are not born with expressions. We learn them just as we learn other forms of language from people who share the same culture. Nonverbal communication is generally displayed through the use of gestures and facial expressions. Like other forms of language, nonverbal communication is not the same in all cultures. This can be seen through hand signals such as a thumbs up sign. In the U.S., this particular sign indicates a job well done, while in Australia, the same hand gesture is considered rude and unacceptable. Another related form of communication is the use of symbols to convey meanings to others. Symbols are gestures, objects, and words that form the basis of human communication. A smiley face, a school uniform, or a country flag are symbols which provide us with the means of making sense of our surroundings. All societies have ways of encouraging and enforcing what is deemed appropriate and inappropriate behavior. The standard behaviors adhered to are labeled as norms. A norm that is important to members of society is gender, which is a social expectation or guideline due to our biological sex. Females and males are socialized from an early age to this norm in such ways as clothing and emotional and physical growth. Norms infiltrate every situation, thought, and action that its members are involved with. Norms are a constant in this respect. Sociologists distinguish between norms in two ways. They are categorized as either formal or informal. Formal norms are typically recorded and stipulate punishment for violators, which to most of us we identify with as being the law, a form of governmental social control. Law is the most significant formal norm, but other norms can be displayed through the requirements that must be followed in order to become employed through a particular company, or maybe even the rules to a game show. Informal norms are generally not recorded, but are understood by the majority of a society's members. Proper dress, walking on the right side of a two-way hallway, or bringing a pen and paper to a classroom setting are considered informal norms. Societies have no specific punishments or sanctions for a person who violates an informal norm. Perhaps the person walking on the wrong side of the hallway will get a stern look or told to move to the other side, but definitely will not be put on trial with a possible prison sentence. Norms are also categorized by their relative importance to society. These categories are referred to as mores or folkways. Mores are norms that are important to the welfare of society. Societies demand that mores be obeyed, and if not followed, can lead to severe penalties. The U.S. has strong mores against murder and child abuse, which have been institutionalized into formal norms. Folkways are norms that govern everyday behavior, which shape our normal daily behaviors of members of a society. Society is less likely to formalize a folkway than mores with their violations raising little concern. For example, the person going the wrong way in the hallway. Norms, whether mores or folkways, are not always followed, even when an individual is aware of the circumstances of noncompliance. For example, let's examine the social interactions involving a minor drinking alcohol. Generally speaking, the likelihood of a minor drinking in the presence of a police officer or his parents is doubtful due to the minor's exposure and conforming to formal norm which deems such behavior as being unacceptable. Now let's look at the likelihood of alcohol consumption if the same minor has joined a group of peers at a keg party. Conformity is still an issue, but motivations have changed directions. Motivation is now focused on having fun, being connected to the group. It's a means of validation of their actions and even status. This is the end of Chapter 3, Part 2. There are 3 parts to this presentation. Be sure to view all 3 parts.